Magnus the Red was the Cyclops Primarch of the Thousand Sons Legion of Space Marines. A man of intelligence and ambition, Magnus lived a life devoted to the study of the arcane arts, and, when the Great Crusade rolled around, how to best apply those arts to benefit mankind. But the gift of knowledge wasn't given freely. Delving too deep into the mysteries of the warp and for too long could lead the sorcerers of the Thousand Sons to devolve into mindless, homicidal monsters known as Chaos Spawn. This is obviously a detriment. And adding that on top of all the crazy psychic tyrants that the Great Crusade had toppled led the Emperor to issue a decree that banned the use of psychic powers throughout the Imperium. But when Magnus learned that his brother Primarch Horus had betrayed the Emperor, Magnus knew he had to do something. So, he drew upon his great psychic might and tried to connect his mind directly to the Emperor. However, that blasted the wards apart in the human section of the Webway the Emperor was building, and chaos ensued in the Imperial Palace that almost led to a demonic breach of Terra itself. And the Emperor was pretty mad at Magnus for that, and so he ordered him and his legion brought to Terra to face his judgment. That is, until Horus intercepted that transmission and instead ordered Magnus and his legion to be killed. This led to the momentous burning of Prospero and the Thousand Sons and their Primarch being fully corrupted by the powers of chaos. Now you're probably thinking, okay Colin, that was a cool history lesson, but what was the point? Well, today, we're going to talk about an age-old question in the 40k fandom, and one that I get asked every time I play Thousand Sons at a game shop, and that is, did Magnus do anything wrong? We're going to touch on the morality and legality of Magnus' actions regarding his use of psychic powers in general, as they pertain to warning the Emperor, and what he did once he learned that the Space Wolves and the Custodies were coming to annihilate him. The idea is that we're going to paint a complete picture of Magnus' actions from the Edict of Nikaea to his devotion to Tzeentch, with a little bit of Thousand Sons history sprinkled in between, so that we can finally answer the question that has baffled 40k players and lore scholars alike. Welcome back to StarHammer. To understand why Big E got pissy at Magnus, we gotta understand two very critical moments in the Great Crusade timeline: the Emperor's withdrawal from the Crusade, and the Council of Nikaea. The Council of Nikaea was a meeting of the minds of the Imperium. The Emperor, Malcador, all the Primarchs, the Sisters of Silence, and even some Space Marine librarians were present. And the entire point was to decide, once and for all, if the use of psychic powers should be allowed within the Astartes and the Imperium as a whole. Leading up to this were the forces of the Great Crusade, which came across enthralled populations more and more often. Typically, these planets were being held captive under the sway of a demonic-possessed sorcerer serving as the planetary ruler, and the Astartes had to deal with more wanton destruction than necessary. And the atrocities committed by these sorcerers had most legions fed up with the whole thing in general. And as I mentioned earlier, the overexposure to the warp experienced by Thousand Sons Psykers would eventually have them devolve into horrific chaos spawn. Malformed, demented, gibbering monsters that would lash out at their brothers and innocents around them. On the other hand, psychic powers could be used to benefit the Imperium. Besides the necessary ones needed for transportation and communication, the mighty powers of the warp have been used by the Thousand Sons and Magnus to bring entire planets into Imperial compliance without firing a single shot. Magnus and his legion also advocated for the responsible use of psychic knowledge to ensure it didn't fall into the wrong hands. So to combat that, Magnus and some of the other Primarchs got together and developed the Librarius program to train and educate Space Marine Psykers and keep them safe from the corrupting influences of the warp. And for the most part, this is a very effective program. While great effort was made to make the use of psychic powers both effective, regulated, and safe, some Primarchs like Rogel Dorn and Leman Russ downright refused to fight alongside any legions that use librarians. After seeing what could become of them with the chaos mutations plaguing the Thousand Sons, some of the Primarchs believed that the safety and honor of their legion was more important than any potential boon the warp could provide. Magnus argued that all knowledge was good knowledge. The only thing he was guilty of was the pursuit, safekeeping, and responsible use of that knowledge, and that while dealing with psychic influences was risky, he and his legion were best poised to figure out its secrets and how to use it to benefit humanity as a whole. But while Magnus made a compelling argument at the council, his opposition was just as moving. Against him, the Sisters of Silence, the psychic gnolls of the Legio Custodes, brought within the proofs that many of humanity's past and current problems was indeed caused by the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. They show that Psykers enslaved to the warp were responsible for some of the worst atrocities ever committed against humankind, brought up the rampant mutations of the Thousand Sons that they had yet to figure out a solution to, and example after example of gifted Psykers using their powers for evil. It sure didn't help Magnus' case that several in attendance, especially the Emperor himself, were already biased against Psykers to begin with. But Magnus' own testimony was one thing. What about those he advocated for? A conclave of Astartes librarians took the stand and made the argument that a psyker was like an athlete. The more an athlete trained and honed their skills, the better they became at their craft. But the psyker was also a tool, and, not dissimilar to a gun or a sword, could be used for both good and evil purposes. They, like Magnus, argued that the librarian should be strictly monitored and educated by the Imperium to prevent the act of sorcery and to use their powers to only benefit mankind. So let's stop there for a second. There's a difference between simply harnessing your psychic powers and sorcery. Simply calling upon your innate abilities as a psyker is just that, using a tool that you have. Sorcery is the act of knowing how to wield powers that had to be sought or bargained for. The shit you had to dig deep into forbidden tomes to find. The shit you had to bargain with demons for. The librarians noted that rogue sorcerers were a problem. Nobody was denying that. However, they also stated that the regulation and education of the Astartes psykers, including those of the Thousand Sons, should be punished accordingly for even attempting such dangerous acts. Now, the Emperor, being the most powerful psyker to ever live, has a decision to make. The Emperor never wanted the Primarchs, Space Marines, or anyone to have any interaction with the Warp, because he knew the dangers that lurked within. After all, he's had tens of thousands of years to explore all that himself. He didn't believe that humanity was spiritually or physically ready to deal with the Warp and come out on top. The risk was simply too great. Though Magnus and his legion were talented and meant well, the Emperor feared that with repeated exposure, it was only a matter of time before things got out of hand. Later on, this would be one of the driving factors of the Emperor's Webway project. If he couldn't erase the psychic gene from humanity, he could at least give psykers a safe place to mature their powers without fear of corruption. And so, after hearing everyone out, the Emperor issued this edict. Hear now the words of my ruling. I am not blind to the needs of the Imperium, but nor am I blind to the realities of the hearts of men. I hear men speak of knowledge and power as though they are abstract concepts to be employed simply as a sword or gun. They are not. Power is a living force, and the danger with power is obsession. A man who attains a measure of power will find it comes to dominate his life until all he can think of is the acquisition of more. Nearly all men can stand adversity, but few can stand the ultimate test of character, that of wielding power without succumbing to its darker temptations. Peering into the darkness to gain knowledge of the Warp is fraught with peril, for it is an inconstant place of shifting reality, capricious lies, and untruths. The seeker after truth must have a care he is not deceived, for false knowledge is far more dangerous than ignorance. All men wish to possess knowledge, but few are willing to pay the price. Always men will seek to take the shortcut, the quick route to power, and it is a man's own mind, not his enemy or foe, that will lure him to evil ways. True knowledge is gained only after the acquisition of wisdom. Without wisdom, a powerful person does not become more powerful. He becomes reckless. His power will turn on him and eventually destroy all he has built. I have walked paths no man can know and faced the unnameable creatures of the Warp. I understand all too well the secrets and dangers that lurk in its hidden darkness. Such things are not for lesser minds to know, no matter how powerful or knowledgeable they believe themselves to be. The secrets I have shared served as warnings, not enticements to explore further. Only death and damnation await those who pry too deeply into secrets not meant for mortals. I see now that I've allowed my sons to delve too profoundly into matters I should never have permitted them to know even existed. Let it be known that no one shall suffer censure, that this conclave is to serve unity, not discord. But no more shall the threat of sorcery be allowed to taint the warriors of the Astartes. Henceforth, it is my will that no legion will maintain a librarius department. All its warriors and instructors must be returned to battle companies, and never again employ any psychic powers. Woe betide he who ignores my warnings or breaks faith with me. He shall be my enemy, and I will visit such destruction upon him and all his followers that, until the end of all things, he shall rue the day he turned from my light. This banned Magnus and his legion from using their powers and created the chaplains, inspired by the word bearers, to ensure the imperial truth and the emperor's will were upheld within the legions. Magnus, though defeated and disappointed, accepted the decree, though it wasn't long after that he was trying to find ways to circumvent it. I know that was a lot, but it's important to give context to what happens next and what gave rise to the whole Magnus did nothing wrong thing in the first place. Besides continuing to try and practice sorcery in secret, Magnus was loyal to a fault. He got along very well with the Emperor, being one of the few Primarchs without daddy issues. Though occasionally reckless and wild as a commander, Magnus and his Thousand Sons had an exemplary record under their belt. Even after Nikaea, their loyalty could never be doubted, even if everyone else thought they were a bunch of weird nerds. Eventually, the Emperor put Horus in charge of the Great Crusade and left to work on his Webway project back on Terra. The Webway was a sort of side dimension developed by the Eldar back in ancient times that was totally separate from the Warp and its influence. It allowed extremely quick, if not instant, interstellar travel between its gates and would have removed humanity's dependence on the Warp for communication and travel. That was obviously going to be a huge dub if he could pull it off. The problem is that while the Emperor had access to a Webway portal in his palace, he didn't have the means to replicate the metaphysical Eldari structures that held it all together. As his workers carved through the Webway like a mine shaft, the Emperor had to be upon the Golden Throne to keep things running and project psychic barriers around the entry point to keep any warp demons out. He never told the Primarchs about the project, and this is why it demanded his full attention. In the last days of the Great Crusade, Magnus was meditating on Prospero, his homeworld, when he was struck with a vision. His vision showed him that Horus would fall to chaos, along with several other Primarchs and their legions, and basically had the entire civil war play out right in front of him, his own fate being excluded. Ever loyal, Magnus knew that he needed to warn someone. He first tried to reach out to Horus in an attempt to contact him before his wounding by the poop knife and the corruption that came after, but found he was too late. He then decided to contact the Emperor himself, but deemed that the official channels of astral telepathy were too slow. So, he got several of his topsiders and conducted a projection ritual. When Magnus came across the Webway portal leading to the Emperor, he found it impenetrable. Seemingly out of options, a voice whispered to him in the warp, promising him the power he needed to break through. Out of desperation, Magnus agreed and burst through the wards of the Emperor. This, in turn, led to a breach in the human Webway extension and allowed the demons of the warp to immediately attack. This led to the deaths of hundreds and a direct assault on the palace by demons, which the Emperor and his small group of custodians barely managed to hold back. Magnus was mortified by what he had done, and upon his return to the physical realm, was visited by Tzeentch, the Chaos God of Change, who told Magnus they had sealed his fate by claiming the power that allowed him to break through the Emperor's barriers, though now his only purpose was to serve the powers of chaos one way or another. Magnus, turns out, had been puppeteered by Tzeentch from the start. His relentless pursuit of knowledge had made it easy for Tzeentch to put Magnus on a path that would have led him to his eternal service. Even the Council of Nikaea was, to some degree, all part of the plan. The Emperor was furious at Magnus for destroying decades of Webway work, for jeopardizing Terra itself, and for using sorcery in blatant disregard for his edict. He sent the Space Wolves and Leman Russ, longtime rivals of Thousand Suns, to bring Magnus and his legion to Terra to face judgment. However, a corrupted Horus intercepted that communication, and instead ordered the Space Wolves to destroy the Thousand Suns. This led to the burning of Prospero, and is what sealed the deal with the Thousand Suns fully entering the service of chaos. Hanging his head in shame, Magnus decided he was going to go out with a bang. In one final display of loyalty, he ordered his fleet to disperse from orbit above Prospero, and engulfed his world in a psychic bubble to prevent the other sorcerers and the planetary defenses from sensing the upcoming invasion. And he warned no one. Magnus now understood that this was an attempt at a 1-2 punch by Tzeentch to have these two loyal legions destroy one another. So Magnus did what he could to throw a wrench in that plan. But as his world burned and his people died, Magnus began to doubt his own inaction. Had what he did truly warranted such a scorched earth reaction from his father? Centuries upon centuries of knowledge were being burned along with his people, and a depressed Magnus decided to take to the field himself. Now, when he fought Leman Russ and was almost killed by him, Tzeentch extended his hand again and offered to save Magnus and his legion if he pledged himself and them to his eternal service. Magnus, out of desperation once again, accepted the bargain. Tzeentch immediately fulfilled its end of the bargain and immediately ferried the defeated Primarch and the Thousand Suns to a world in the warp that he had already prepared for them. So, with knowing all that, we have a pretty good picture of what Magnus did to get to where he is today. So, did Magnus do anything wrong? Well, it's not that black and white. Legally, Magnus did the wrong thing. By using sorcery to contact the Emperor and opening himself up to corruption, Magnus directly violated the Emperor's ruling. One could argue that he did the right thing morally, as it's sometimes better to ask forgiveness than permission. But his actions led to the deaths of hundreds of innocent people, along with the casualties suffered by the Custodians and the Silent Sisters, but he also had no way of knowing what was to come from his actions. Now, ignorance doesn't excuse bad behavior, but it can explain it. Magnus was loyal to a fault. He believed in the Emperor and his vision for humanity, even if it didn't line up entirely with his own. So, was it more ignorance or arrogance that brought down this once proud son of the Emperor? Magnus was, after the Emperor, probably the second most powerful psyker in the galaxy, perhaps more so than Malkador. He was extremely good at understanding psychic powers and how to obtain the forbidden knowledge needed to advance said powers. Though he had a lot of book smarts, one could say Magnus didn't have a lot of street smarts, and that's what led to his final predicament. We could also say that his pride led to his downfall, a common theme in the 40k setting and fantasy in general. Despite the Emperor's ruling, he continued his research and practice of the mystic arts, exposing himself willingly to Tzeentch's influence even though he didn't know it at the time. You'd think with all his extensive knowledge of the warp and its workings that he would realize and take the appropriate measures to protect himself. Instead, he pursued more and more forbidden lore with reckless abandon and didn't heed the Emperor's warning. Every kid disobeys their parents, but not every kid causes the deaths of hundreds while putting billions of other lives at risk, while also destroying their dad's prized science project. The Emperor was right to be angry with Magnus, and even warned him before the Council of Nikaea had disbanded. He said, "If you treat with the warp, Magnus, I shall visit destruction upon you, and your legion's name will be struck from imperial records for all time." The Emperor knew Magnus was ambitious, and that he was limiting his son's favorite pastime, but he was right. Humanity, even the Primarchs, and his most gifted psychic son, were not ready to deal with the warp and the dangers it presented. Unlike the Emperor, who had lifetimes of understanding, Magnus's knowledge was barely scratching the surface compared to that of the Emperor's. Though Magnus, in his pride, believed that despite that he and his legion could prove his father wrong, that ultimately led to the exact opposite when he pledged his soul to Tzeentch. And Tzeentch, for its part, used this to its advantage. Slowly but surely, Tzeentch very subtly guided Magnus on a predetermined path to damnation. The Emperor's Webway project would be a great detriment to Tzeentch and his fellow Chaos Gods, as they'd no longer have much influence over the beings whose emotions and actions gave them the most power. They were scared, and they knew that if the Emperor was allowed to succeed, that it might very well spell doom for them. That is why Magnus was the perfect pawn. His pride meant that no matter what the Emperor decreed, Magnus would still pursue his own ends. He would be mostly loyal, of course, but mostly loyal was the little bit that Tzeentch needed to enact its plans of self-preservation, and as a way to strike back at the Emperor, who the Chaos Gods saw as the very embodiment of order, their total opposite. While Nurgle had the poop knife that allowed a wedge for them to corrupt Horus, Tzeentch used Magnus's own fantastical mind against himself, knowing that his loyalty would eventually require him to act out of desperation, which it did. He also knew that Magnus's natural instinct for self-preservation would override his loyalty to the Emperor, and that his love for all knowledge wouldn't allow him to sit idly by while Prospero burned. Though Magnus didn't know it, and despite his best efforts once he realized Tzeentch's influence, his arrogance had led to his downfall. It had led to the deaths of hundreds and humanity doomed to eternal reliance on the warp, as the Emperor now had to sit on the Golden Throne to keep the Webway portal closed and the demons within out. A fate that, had things turned out differently, may have been reserved for Magnus. I think that Magnus ultimately did the right thing morally, but the road to hell is paved in good intentions. Despite doing the right thing on many levels, such as trying to contact Horus, then contacting his dad, who he knew would be able to stop the coming storm, to sacrificing his legion and himself as a final act of loyalty, Magnus did do something wrong. In fact, when you factor in Tzeentch's influence, he did everything wrong. Knowingly or otherwise, Magnus's actions, despite being good in nature, fucked over everything for everyone else in the end, including himself. As a biased Thousand Sons player, that's hard to admit, but when you look at the bigger picture as the Emperor was doing at Nikaea, Magnus did, in fact, do a lot wrong. His actions led to his internal damnation, the Emperor's grave wounding, and the Imperium becoming the fractured and besieged mess that it is today. Is he responsible for all of it? Of course not. But his arrogance not only led to his fall, but the Imperium's fall from greatness as well. At least in part, considering the machinations of chaos are usually a group effort. Magnus, Lorgar, Angron, all selfish and prideful, destroy the new golden era humanity had carved out for itself. And that's all I got for this one, y'all. Magnus is my favorite Primarch, and though he's won me many a game on the board, I gotta be real, he screwed up big time. Argue with me in the comments and let me know what you think about Magnus and all his doings. Do you think he was wrong too, or do you maintain his innocence? Imagine you're explaining your take to the Emperor. How would you present your case as either the prosecutor or the defense attorney at Magnus' trial today? As always, drop a like if you like it, a subscribe if you really liked it. Don't forget to check out the community tab for shitposts and shenanigans. Links to my Blue Sky and other goodies in the description, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Toodles.